And my name is Nancy Swanner. I'm the founding director of the Granger Cobb Institute for Senior Living, which is one of the majors in the hospitality school, the third major in the hospitality school, actually, and our newest major. And I'm thrilled today to be here. We have a wonderful speaker that we have invited out. And I'll talk about her in just a second, but I wanted to acknowledge just a few people who are with us today that I want to make sure that you know. Mr. Adam Clark. Adam Clark is the president of Aegis Development for Aegis Living, and he is the chair of the steering committee for our Granger Cobb Institute. So thank you. We also have with us Oliver Meinzer, this guy in the front row. You got to watch him. Vice President of Global Operations for Digital and Guest Services for Marriott, and he is the chair of the Hospitality Advisory Board, also an alum. And also with us today, we have Dr. Mario Reyes. Mario is a professor in finance in the Carson College of Business, but he is our interim director in the School of Hospitality Business Management. And then also with us today, we have some faculty here, we have some other advisory board members, but I also want to call out Darcy Baggett. Probably everybody in the room should, well, if you don't, well, you do. She knows everybody. Everybody knows Darcy Baggett, but Darcy Baggett is the assistant director of the Granger Cobb Institute for Senior Living, and she's truly the one that makes all the magic happen. She's the one that got Tracy with us here today and has taken care of all the details. She just tells me where to be and what time to be there and what I need to do. And so I very much appreciate everything that Darcy does for us. So thanks, and I'm glad you're all here. Dr. Tracy Gendron is the author of Ageism Unmasked, Exploring Age Bias and How to End It. And I just read that. I started it on Thursday and finished it on Sunday. And oh, wow, am I a failure? I'll just tell you that. Everyone should read it. It's quite an eye-opener. And Tracy will talk about this. I've heard her speak, and she was incredible. And but this whole notion about ageism, I always think about it on the older end, and oh wow, there's a whole lot about ageism for young people as well. So I'm excited, but it was a great book. She serves as the chair for Virginia Commonwealth University Department of Gerontology and as director for the Virginia Center on Aging. She is an internationally recognized gerontologist with almost 30 years of experience as a grant-funded researcher and speaks to audiences globally, but the real-world impact of age bias. Tracy has a master's degree in gerontology, or a master's degree in psychology and a PhD in developmental psychology. And she's also gearing up because she's been invited to go do a TED Talk in Vegas here pretty soon. So, now we all know somebody, so that's a big deal. Please help us welcome Dr. Tracy Gendron.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So appreciate it. Thank you. And yes, I will say this is the smallest airport I have ever been in. Wow, Pullman is a small airport. So really nice to be here. Came from Virginia to have this amazing conversation with you. Thank you for the introduction. I have been studying aging for about 30 years now. And I myself didn't fully learn about ageism or understand ageism until maybe 10, 15 years ago. And that's when I kind of had some of my first realizations that even as a trained gerontologist, I was holding a lot of ageism within and expressing a lot of ageism. So it opened up this whole world for me to do research, to understand, to really think about what ageism meant, and to think about what the real world impact is. So I'm gonna just kind of walk you through some of that today about some of what I think. Hopefully you'll have some realizations. But really, I like to have this as much more of a conversation than a lecture. So if you feel like you have a comment or a question, or I ask you to yell stuff out, please do, because this is a topic that is actually relevant to all of us in our everyday lives. So I am getting ready to do this TEDx, and it's Reno, not Vegas, but close. And my opening for this is gonna kind of be asking the audience, who thinks of themselves as part of the aging population? Raise your hand. Who's older today than they were yesterday? Okay, yeah, right, exactly. Aging is all of us. So I think where we need to start this conversation is thinking about what ageism is, what aging is, before we lead into a conversation about ageism. So do you know the difference between a geriatrician and a gerontologist? Anyone know? You know what a geriatrician is? Okay, so a geriatrician is somebody that studies a branch of medicine related to the treatment of older people, looking at common age-related conditions that happened. It's really focused on one aspect of aging, which is our physiology and our biology. And it's important that we have geriatricians because lots of things in our bodies change as we get older. Some things that we don't even know, like, do you know you could be on a medication for 30, 40 years, and all of a sudden when you're older, it stops working, or it works differently, because our metabolism changes as we grow older. So it's hard to wrap your head around that, because you're like, but this has always worked for me. But things change as we age. So a geriatrician is focused on biological aging. A gerontologist, on the other hand, is somebody that studies holistic aging. And holistic aging is the bio, psycho, social, spiritual aspects of aging. So we change within our bodies, we change within our psyche, we change within our social roles, and many of us change in terms of a sense of spirituality. So when you're thinking about aging, we largely misunderstand aging as a culture in two different ways. One is that, like a geriatrician thinks, we tend to think about aging as a process of decline alone, right? Most of us are really familiar with the way that our bodies change over time. We have things that we talk about like being over the hill when you're over a certain age. We think about it as a process of decline, that we just continue to lose ability, that we continue to lose value. And the truth is we do have biological change and biological decline. We're mortal. But that's not what aging is. Aging is the process of change. And that change includes decline, but it also includes growth. We never stop growing. We never stop evolving. And if anything, there's many things that we continue to get better at as we age, regardless of any decline that we have. So when we see aging as decline alone, that's the first thing that leads us into ageism. The second one is kind of my story of my realization moment that I myself was carrying ageism within me. So when people would ask, as they often do, why did you become a gerontologist? My standard answer would always be, well, I wanted to get all of this biopsychosocial knowledge so that I could best serve the aging population, so that I could best work with the aging population. Until one day I had that moment of going, why do I call older people the aging population when we are all aging? Why is it us versus them? And that's when I realized how deeply embedded ageism was within me, right? If we're thinking of aging as being something that has nothing to do with us, then we're thinking about it as those people, those old people, those other people. And that separates us from them, and it separates us from seeing ourselves as aging people. So if we misunderstand aging as a process of only decline and as something that happens to others, that kind of leads us into ageism. So when we get started with this conversation of ageism, I think it's important for you to make it personal. So I want you to think about these questions and think about them for yourself. What do you think it means to be old? What do you think it means to be young? How do you feel about your own aging? Really, what do you think about growing older? And then how do you talk about it? Do you talk about it as if you're growing older? That's a very purposeful, proactive thing. Or do you talk about it as getting older? So let me ask you, when you think of the word old, what comes to mind? How would you define old? Yell it out. Wise. You can say good and bad. What comes to mind? Experienced. What else? Aching joints. What was that? Cranky. Thank you. Okay, cranky. I did this talk like last week, and the first word that someone said was decrepit. So yeah, I mean, it's stuff like that. What about young? When you think of the word young, what do you think of? Potential. Energy. What else? Naive? Okay, beautiful. All right, so if we have words like old that could mean anything from cranky and experienced and wise and achy joints to young that could mean potential, wise, but also maybe inexperienced, they're meaningless. We assign multiple meanings to these words. So if we have something that has multiple meanings to it, but we're assigning value to it, we got to think about how we use these words old and young. The truth is, old and young don't have any value judgment to them. Old means longer lived and young means shorter lived. We assign it meaning and value. So when we tell someone they're either too old or too young, or if we think about how old do you feel, old is not really a feeling, just like young is not. It's not one thing. So I think it's important to get to some of the roots of the language that we use when we're talking about this. So when we talk about aging, I think it's really important for us to contextualize it. Aging doesn't happen in a vacuum. Aging is really interesting because aging is the one thing that we all have in common, and yet no two people experience it in the same way. So the way that we age really depends on all of the other forms of identities that we have, some of which we're born with, some of which we pick up along the way, some in which we may choose. These are things not only like race and gender, ethnicity, but our language, where we live, whether it's like urban or rural, what kind of education we have. All of these things come together to shape how we age. And many of those things will provide opportunities, and many of those things will create barriers for us. Okay, but it's all kind of mixed up into these different forms of identities. Age is a really interesting form of identity, though, because it's one that continually changes over time. Not all forms of identity do. Some ability can as well. But think about it. The way that you feel about yourself at 20 and the way the world reacts to you at 20 is different when you're 40 and different when you're 60 and different when you're 80. We're constantly forming and reforming our age identity. So it's really fluid, and it's something that is, constantly working on over time. The other interesting thing is, as I said, some forms of identities will provide opportunities for us as we age and some barriers. So there was a study in my hometown of Richmond they did like 5-10 years ago. And they looked at life expectancy on the same road, it's called Broad Street, the same main road from 5 miles east to 5 miles west. And they just kind of looked at demographics and how long people lived. And what they found was really shocking. So they found that 5 miles up the road, which was a predominantly white, well-off, affluent community, they lived 20 years longer on average than 5 miles down the road, which was a predominantly Black, African American, and income insecure community. 20 years of life expectancy. That's because of all of those things. Not because of individuals, but because even when you look at the environments of these two, is it safe to walk? Right? Or are there cracks in the sidewalk? Is the lighting proper? Is there access to healthy foods in a grocery store and transportation? All of these things come together to influence how well we age. So we need to think about it because we need to see each person as an individual. One of the other things that I find really interesting that I think about is how we develop over time. I am a developmental gerontologist. So all of those things that happen to us over time clearly influence who we become as we get older. We have all of these words and this understanding of what it means to be in different stages of life, right? We readily understand things like infancy and toddlerhood and childhood and adolescence. And we even have a term called emerging adulthood, right? And that's kind of to describe this gap between when we're in adolescence and when we become an adult. Meanwhile, how do you even define becoming an adult? Do you become an adult at 18? Maybe legally, but what does it mean to be an adult, right? So we know that there's some nuance there. But then we just kind of talk about older adulthood. So we just talk about adult, and then somehow it just morphs into older adulthood. We don't have a word or a term or an understanding of what potential there is for later life development. So I call it elderhood, and I call it elderhood for a reason. Not to say that older people are not adults, of course they are. But what if we thought about elderhood in a completely different way? What if instead of the busyness and the hurriedness of adulthood, the way that we determine success as an adult, building a family, building a career, buying your house, whatever kind of those things are, there's a lot of busyness and activity. What if we thought of elderhood as a time for a different kind of potential? Maybe even a time when slowing down and turning inward was seen as developmentally normal and appropriate. Maybe a time where we thought elders could contribute in different ways that weren't even economic, but were in different ways. So elderhood to me is a time that has power. It's a word that has power and potential. So the way that we usually define older adulthood now is not even just older adulthood. We tend to call it retirement, right? You've heard people always say that they're retired. But what I want to tell you is retirement is not a life stage. Retirement is a social institution. Retirement is a social institution. When somebody tells me, and they often do when they introduce themselves, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm retired." All right, that's cool, I get it. It means that you used to work full time, but it doesn't tell me anything about you, about who you are, about what your goals are, about who you're becoming. It's not an identity, it's about work. So I think to me, if we use retirement to talk about a whole life stage, we're talking about something we used to do and used to be. That's a withdrawal, as opposed to elderhood is who I am and who I am becoming. There's a big difference in that, and words do matter, and the way that we think about this really matters. So I think elderhood is a word that has power and potential. Yeah. Yeah, it depends too. And what is middle age is also another good question. And especially now as we're living longer, the question was, where would middle age fall, if you didn't hear? What is middle age? That also depends for each person, right? That also depends on our longevity. And people are working longer, and people have more meaning and purpose in work longer. So I'm not even sure what that means or why we necessarily need to define it in that way. So I think there's a lot to think about here, and a lot of this really influences how we see the world, which is built upon ageism. So if we misunderstand aging, and we think of aging as a process of decline and one about others, and retirement as a stage of life, and not having a full understanding of what growth and development means in later life, then it's no wonder we live in a world whose foundation is built on ageism. So what is ageism? Let's define it for a second. Most people, when I say, tell me what you think ageism is, they'll say, well, that happens to people at work, especially older people that have trouble getting hired and, take longer to find a job. And that's part of it, but it's really much more. Ageism is any time we discriminate, we marginalize, we look at other people and label them as older or younger based on age. We other people. So it's other directed. It's when we see other people and say, you're too old to learn something new. You're too young to possibly be a supervisor. That's other directed ageism, and that's one form. But ageism is also internally directed. It goes back to those questions I asked you a couple minutes ago. Ageism is the shame, the dread, the fear, and the disassociation that we have with our own aging. When we go to great lengths to say, I want to look, act, feel younger, when we deny our age, when we want to cover it up, that's internalized ageism. And most of us carry that around, no blame, no shame. You can't do better until you know better, right? And we live in a culture where this is everywhere. Everywhere, this is what we're taught. And you can see just from some of the little quotes there, the fact that we have a thriving multi-billion-dollar anti-aging industry really says it all. What is anti-aging? Death. If we're not aging, we're dying. But yet we are made to believe, and it's a great industry because it like will never end, that we need to take products and supplements and makeup, and we need to do things to our bodies to make us feel better, feel younger. I was just watching a commercial today for teeth whitening that was like, know what makes you look old? Yellow teeth. And it was like, what's wrong with looking old? There's nothing wrong with wrinkles. It's just that we have judged them to be not desirable. So these are all of the messages, and we see it everywhere. And this is what it looks like. You have a question? Yeah.
I was going to say, this is very much culturally driven. Is there other really similar? So is this something that's kind of
Did everyone hear that? Is this something that's more focused in the US, in US culture versus like Eastern cultures? And I love that, and I get that question every time because it's a great question. And there's kind of two answers to it. The first is the research shows that ageism is pan-cultural. So pretty much ageism is now everywhere. Okay, it's been shown to be everywhere. Why? Well, as economies become more capitalistic, we tend to see a rise in ageism because we view contribution in a different way. But also a lot of societies are becoming more split in terms of intergenerational living and families. And as you see families move away from each other, you also start to see caring for older people as deemed more of a burden. So kind of both of these things. But on the other side, there are some cultures like many African and Asian cultures that have more customs and celebrations that honor older people. And there's definitely some indigenous cultures that elders are revered. So little bit of both, but it's kind of everywhere. Good question. So as you can see from these magazines, you know, you look anywhere and we are taught that aging is something we want to avoid. Okay, the look ageless bit, the anti-aging stuff. It's everywhere, and it's not just in the products, it's in the fact that we don't have a lot of role models for healthy aging, normal aging, even in movies and in television and in books. If you even listen to lyrics of songs, you see how ageist they can be. So this is kind of everywhere. And it's not geared towards one gender, okay? It is both, because that's another question that I get a lot, is this different for men than it is for women? So it is different for men than it is for women, or masculinity and femininity, but the shame, I think, is just directed in a different way. So what do you think is the top product that is marketed to older men? Not hair, that's one. It's a little blue pill. Viagra, yes, Viagra. What does that say? I mean, what is the message behind that? The hair is one thing, but then Viagra is another. There's a lot of shame and a lot of like, well, to be an older man and a successful one, you gotta have the ability, because that's what defines a man. We also don't talk a whole lot about men and caregiving. And yet research shows that most men get a lot of joy out of caregiving. It's like how we used to talk about fathers babysitting for their kids, where it's like, no, you're parenting, right? We do that with older men. So while older women definitely face kind of this double stigma and double shame of being invisible and hypervisible all at the same time. Your hair, your wrinkles, that outfit makes you look younger, that haircut makes you look older, and then also older women feeling as if, you know, the glance just goes over them. What they say doesn't really matter. They do have a harder time finding a job, and older women are definitely more at risk of poverty because of the wage gap, the gender wage gap. So there's things that play out in both of these, but it's not just one or the other. There's shame to go everywhere, shame for everyone. So why does this matter? And I think this is a really important slide and a really important message. It doesn't matter because I'm here to tell you that it matters. It doesn't matter because I am passionate about it. It actually matters for your health and your happiness. This is more than an equity issue, although it is an equity issue. I think everybody should have the right to age with dignity, right to age with being able to access all opportunities to them. So I do think it's an equity issue, but we have more than 20 years of solid research that shows that attitudes about your own aging impact your health, impact your ability to recover from illnesses, impact the possibility of developing the very things you fear. Do you know that people with more negative attitudes about aging are more likely to manifest mild cognitive impairment? They are more likely to have depression. They are more likely to have the genes for Alzheimer's, the biomarkers for Alzheimer's. There was a landmark study done over 20 years ago that showed that people that had positive views of aging lived 7.5 years longer than people that had negative views. And that was a really solid study done out of Yale, and it showed that that effect was even after accounting for loneliness, for functional health, for gender, for race, for all kinds of things. So it matters to our health. You know, it's just like we talk about social isolation as being bad for our health. This is equivalent to that. When we carry that dread and that stress and that fear, that does damage to our body. So if there's one thing you can take away, I hope this is what it is. You know, remember that this is actually about you. This is about your loved ones. This is about, you know, much more than it just being the right thing to do. So there's a lot of reasons about why it matters. It also matters in terms of healthcare. So this was another study that was done that showed that the cost of ageism is $63 billion a year annually in healthcare expenditures. This is in part because of the manifestation of those negative health consequences that I mentioned. That's one piece of it. But it's also because of the dysfunction that happens within the healthcare system itself. So I don't know if any of you have ever either been in a situation where you're with an older person at a doctor's office or, you know, somewhere where you're accompanying someone. Have you ever seen a physician or a nurse or any healthcare practitioner talk to you or talk to the person that the older person is with instead of talk to them? It happens a lot. It happens a lot. Have you ever had the experience of seeing an older person, or you yourself, if you're an older person, saying, you should just expect pain, it's normal at your age? Or not examine something in more detail and depth because they say, well, you're just old. All of those really impact how people access health and healthcare. If you've had a bad experience, do you think you're going to want to go back? So it really poses barriers for people seeking out then care after that. I was once with my dad, and he has a real bad back, and we were out at some kind of festival or something, and he really needed to sit down because his back was cramping. And there wasn't any good place to sit down. So we just he leaned against a pole and he sat, and a very well-meaning person came up to us and said to me, is he okay? I'm like, ask him. Why are you asking me? But these are the things that happen. So when you put all of these things together, it has an impact. There's also a huge rate of misdiagnosis, of underdiagnosis. Pain is one of the most undertreated conditions among older people. Things like depression and dementia get misdiagnosed and confused because we think of memory loss as a normal part of aging. It isn't. Most people don't have dementia, by the way. So these are all things that impact ageism in healthcare. So when we think about ageism, I think we also need to understand how it intersects with business and technology, because there's definite overlaps there as well. So another story with my mom this time, we were out at a restaurant right after COVID. And you know how they took menus away and they added QR codes, right? So that you wouldn't have to touch anything, which was great. So the first time we went out and they didn't have a menu, and my mom was looking at the QR code, and she got that she was supposed to put her phone up to it, but she kept putting her phone and taking a picture of it. And she was getting really frustrated. So, you know, I just showed her, I'm like, you hover it, and then you see the link and you do it. She's like, okay. And it got me thinking, we design technology without the input of older people, for older people, and then we don't teach them how to use it. It's a problem. Who gives directions on how to use a QR code? You didn't. You know, now it's kind of everywhere, but for the first time, it's easy to see how somebody who didn't, you know, ever see it before wouldn't know how to use it. But we often do that, yeah. You took a picture the first time too. I probably did too. Exactly. But then, you see the waiter going by and giggling and laughing, and it didn't make her feel good. And then it's like, that's an example of older people aren't good with technology. And then that stereotype feeds itself. So we make these things and we make these products and we don't ask older people for their input on these products. And the big data that we're using, and this goes for AI too, does not include the voices of older people. At all. At all. If anything, sometimes it's deliberately left out. So, we need to think about this kind of intersection and business opportunities. And in senior living, you all talk about this. You all know this, and you all know that when we're designing and we're thinking about this, to have the input of older people is critical, but to think of it as what older people want, not just what they need. And there's a difference there. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can cover what older people need, safety, security, all of that stuff. But what about building for purpose, for meaning making, for self-actualization, for people to grow? Yeah.
Special ones where you could like put a picture of us so you could like recognize it and it would just automatically die on that program it that way. Doesn't, but that was tiered for someone with either dementia or someone older that just like needs that type of recognition. Does it start othering the market when we do it like that? Or is it more inclusive?
I think that, did everyone hear that? Yeah, enough? Zoom's not going to be able to hear that. Okay, so we're talking about specific technology if it is designed for somebody who has some kind of specific need, and that's age-based. Is that ageist or is that more inclusive? So, I think as technology gets more ubiquitous, we're starting to see that things like wearables and hearables and those kinds of like devices that might have big buttons or are easier to access, I think people are starting to see that that could be more inclusive and universal than just older people. Because what is it just designing for older people? But that it'll have utility for a variety of different people. But of course, there's still going to be marketing that's towards your target market. And I understand that too. I don't necessarily think that's ageist if we are designing for people that need a certain kind of product or thing. So have you all seen like these robotic pets? I know that's like used in, senior living and assisted living sometimes. They have like the little cats and the little dogs that people can use and which can be like really helpful, I think, for someone, especially with advanced stages of dementia, because it can give them comfort. Have you seen the robotic seal? Why a seal? I find that so strange. Who has a pet seal? Anyway, I think it's important for us also to think about crossing that line and making sure that we're not kind of walking into the realm of robotic babysitting, and remembering that older people, like all people, need human connection, and that there will never be a substitute. As much as we can use robotics, there will never be a substitute for human connection. And all of that falls into this ageism and technology piece as well. So lately, I've been thinking more about generations and generational bias and how that relates to ageism. So as I said, ageism is towards younger and towards older. Either way, anytime we make an assumption. What I've seen a lot, though, is how we use these generational labels to perpetuate ageism. So y'all familiar with generations, right? These little words that we have, these sticky little words, the boomers, the millennials, Gen X, Gen Z. So it's interesting when you think back to what a generation really is. A generation used to define kind of, your ancestry and your family and all of that. And then we started to label and say, well, it must be that if we're born within a certain period of time, that these historical experiences influence people in similar kinds of ways. So we came up with these catchy little titles to say, well, people were born from here to here because they lived through the same historical experiences, must have certain preferences in common. When you really think about that and you go back to that slide of all those intersections of identities, you realize that makes absolutely no sense. Two people, I guarantee any two of you who want to decide what to have for dinner tonight, who are the same age, are not going to have the same preferences. We don't. And the thing with generations is, other than the baby boomers, they had a reason for calling it baby boomers because there were a certain number of births per year in that. This is all made up. We decide kind of when one starts and when one ends. It really doesn't make sense to assume that everybody in a 15 to 20-year span has the same life experiences. Think about the baby boomers. They were born 1946 to 1964. So if you take that, then you say, okay, baby boomer A was born in 1946. They grew up like in their teens and their 20s in the 1960s. 1960s were a very distinct period of time. Hippie movement, Vietnam War, civil rights, assassinations, all kinds of things were happening. Clearly that was going to affect who they were. Then you have a baby boomer that was born in 1964. They grew up in the 1980s. The 1980s was very different than the 1960s. Technology, Cold War, all kinds of things. And yet we call both of these people baby boomers as if it means something. We have made this into a multi-million-dollar industry by how do we have 5 generations in the workplace? How do we define what millennials want or don't want? It doesn't make any sense. So what we do is we end up like putting labels on it and then stereotyping people based on that. Millennials are lazy. Gen Zers want things their own way, right? It's this pattern that repeats itself over and over, when the truth is we're not seeing the individual that's in front of us, and we have more in common than we do that is separate. So we've got to ditch these generational labels because it leads right to ageism. It just does. I did a study on this, and it showed that millennials and Gen Zers feel the most discriminated against in terms of their generation, and they have the highest level in this study of internalized ageism. So I think it's also a cycle that feeds itself. So we need to remember that this is part of that cycle. The other thing that's important to think about is the specific intersection between ageism and ableism. So while ageism is discrimination based on age, ableism is discrimination based on ability. People can experience disabilities at any time in their life and sometimes all throughout their lives. But as we get older, because we have a decline, we are more likely to experience disability. So it's this double stigma of being discriminated against because I'm old and being discriminated against because I have some kind of limitation. The way that we specifically define successful aging is the perfect example of how ableism and ageism intersect. So successful aging is generally defined as being in good health, being in good physical health, so being physically active, being cognitively intact, and being engaged with life. That's how we define successful aging. 2 things about that. First of all, because we are mortal beings and we will experience decline, it means that none of us will succeed at this. Second of all, if some people are successfully aging, are the rest failing? How does one fail at aging? How is it a failure if I have some kind of limitation or decline? So when we set it up that way, you can see how ageism and ableism really come together to stigmatize and to other people. So I think when we're talking about ageism, we need to understand that ableism is underneath some of that. The fears that other people will devalue us if we use a hearing aid or a walker or a wheelchair or a cane. The fear, which happens often in like an assisted living, that I don't want to dine with those people, right? Because they make me feel uncomfortable. There's ableism and ageism built in to senior living, how we other different people. And I get it, I do, but you also have to understand like the mental consequence of that when we segregate people based on age and based on ability. So this is me and my dad. Wasn't I cute? Doesn't my dad look like very 1970s? Yeah, he does. So this is 1972, and I was 2 and my dad was 27. And the reason I show you this picture is to give you an example of successful aging. So if you would have asked my dad when he was 27 what successful aging meant to him, he would have told you, well, if I can continue to smoke cigarettes, and if I can play in my weekly football game, and if I can bet on horses, he did that. When I am 70, if he had said that at this age, then I will be successful in later life. My dad just turned 79, and he does none of these things now. And he's quite successful. He composes music, he spends time with family, he watches football. They're the New York Jets. They don't do very well, but he still watches them and gets frustrated. So the point of it is, we cannot define our future self based on our current self. And that is another way that we fall into the trap of ageism, that we think, if I don't have what I have right now, if I can define success at this moment in my life based on who I am right now, if I have that later, I'll be good. But you don't know who your later self is going to be. You don't know who your later self is gonna want, or what you're gonna want to do, or how you're going to want to spend your time. So it's one of those internal traps that we fall into. And then on the flip side, I like to say, at that age, when I was 2, the way that I would have defined successful aging was if I could eat SpaghettiOs every day, because that's what I wanted to eat at that point in my life. So if I could do that, then I will be successful. I'm happy to tell you 53-year-old me does not. So thank you, much broader, much healthier palate. So all of this is a lot. You know, it's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to think about, because this really is kind of mind-bendy in the way that we see the world, kind of proposing that there's a different way that we can see the world. So this stays on my to-do list, you know, really forever, kind of thinking about how do we create a world where people have a better understanding of this, so that we can have equity in aging, so that we can thrive in later life. And the good thing is that we've done this before. We have made changes like this before, which means that we can do it again. So when I was out looking for kind of some magazines and some things that I could find that kind of illustrated ageism far back, wanted to see how far back could I find something, I came across this Ladies' Home Journal from 1959. And you will see that right there on the cover, it says how to look and feel 20 years younger. So that shows you how long this has been kind of floating around. It also shows you why many older people have very high levels of internalized ageism. This has never been challenged in their lifetime, right? This is just what they thought, what they knew, what they grew up with. So of course they hold that, you know, being old is awful. We have to kind of unlearn and then relearn. But so this is why it's been floating around for a really long time. So I brought this home and I was looking at it, and then I was like, said to my husband, oh my God, check this out. Right underneath that, there is another banner that says help for unresponsive wives making marriage work. Aren't you like, please, you have to read this article to me. You want to see this, don't you? Yeah, I did too. I was like, I have got to see what this says. So I opened it up and I read it, and the print is really small, so it's going to be hard to see. But this article basically talks about, no joke, I am quoting directly, internal and external defects that women have that cause their marriage not to work. Ladies, defects. Did you know that you had internal and external defects? And some of these defects are listed right here, like, do you insist on always having the last word? Do you neglect to groom your hair and nails well? Okay? Do you pit one man against another? Ladies, do you do this? Do you swear or use coarse language? You know, all of that is pretty much bullshit. That's all that is. So when we look back in history and we see that this is how we used to talk about women, and this is how we used to talk about marriage, you realize we've made some progress, right? We've definitely made some progress since then. You wouldn't see this today. Do we have a way to go? Of course we do, but we're not here anymore. So I think this brings hope. This gives hope that we can do things in a different way. So here's another fun example. Anyone play the game of life when they were a kid? Yeah, you know the game of life? I love the game of life. It's really fun. So the game of life actually originated in 1860, and they update it every few years. So when they update it, they kind of take into mind like what's in the zeitgeist, what has changed, so that they can, add different things to it. So you can see a few different versions of it here and kind of how it's changed over time. Some of the things that they have done is like, you have the pink and the blue pegs. Now they have rainbow pegs, so you can pick whatever color you want. You know how you have like kids that you can have? Now you can have pets. I know, so fun. So all kinds of things that they have done where they keep updating it. But there is something that has stayed the same. And what has stayed the same is, number one, the person with the most money wins. A little classist when you think about it in terms of the game of life. Most money wins. And how do you win? You get to retirement, right? Because there's no life after retirement. Again, this is kind of interesting because it's like, it's what we're teaching kids. And what's fascinating is if you go back to the 1860 version, and this is it, you can see that it was totally different. It was actually really developmental, and it started in infancy, and then you worked your way up, and look how you won. You got 50 points, and you reached a happy old age. I know, that's so nice. That's so nice, but we went from that to this, where if you lose, you are declared destitute, reduced to living on Social Security. This is what we ended up with, and this is where we still are today. This is the game of life. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to say, we got to catch up. What would we tell Milton Bradley is like the next iteration of this? What would we suggest that we can do to make this not so fear-based and limiting in terms of later life? So there's room to grow. And I think it's good that we have examples of how we have grown and good that we have examples of how we can continue to grow. So this is going to stay on my to-do list. I'm going to continue to think about how we message this. So now that you see it, you're going to see it everywhere. You're going to see anti-aging, you're going to see products, you're going to see birthday cards. That's one of the worst offenders, You're going to see it, but that's good. It's going to make you uncomfortable, and that's good, because there are things that we can do together. And that's called disruption. When we disrupt, we choose to do something in a different way. We choose to step out of our comfort zone and be brave and say something. We choose to say, okay, I just caught myself and I'm going to think about this differently now. And this is a process, a lifelong process. I catch myself doing stuff all the time, and I talk about it all the time. So I'm going to share some ways that we can start to disrupt and some things that you can do to think about it. And I think the first thing that we need to do is honestly just take a pause. Again, remember the no blame, no shame. What you didn't know, you didn't know. And it's a journey. So we can pause and we can take a moment and we can reflect on all of the things that we've learned. I mean, really, this hasn't been that long and I've actually thrown quite a bit at you to think about. So pause. Also think about why it matters. What's your source of motivation here? Again, not because I'm telling you it's important, but why is it important to you? Is it because you want 7.5 years? Is it because you want equity within society? Is it because you have great business ideas and you want to be able to move them forward on behalf of older people? We can actually do the right thing and make money at the same time. Those things are not mutually exclusive. So find your source of motivation, and then we can develop the tools to act and say, how do I think about this differently? How do I do this differently? So to get started, here are the things that I want you to remember. Remember that all people are individuals. When you have met one 80-year-old, you've met one 80-year-old. When you have met one millennial, you've met one millennial. It doesn't mean anything about them. So try to let that noise of the labels not affect how you see that person. Remember that age alone does not predict ability. And I'm going to say this without getting into politics. Age alone does not predict ability. Okay, we have a lot of talk right now in politics. We have two of the oldest candidates that we've ever had who are likely going to be the candidates. And all this talk about age and competency, age does not predict competency. If you want to look at competency, look at measures of competency. Don't equate it with age. That's all. And ability does not predict success. We do not have to be able-bodied to be successful or to claim success. Nobody fails at aging. Everybody is successful in their own way. Remember that we are all aging. This is not something about other people. This is about all of us, and we can all claim that in it. We can remember that generations are not homogeneous. Everybody has their own unique life experiences that bring them to where they are and create who they become. And then we can think about elderhood, and we could think about what that entails. What is a strengths-based way to look at later life? What are opportunities for older people to contribute, to have meaning, to have purpose, to feel a sense of belonging? You know, vacations are great, and I write this in the book, but vacations are great because they end. People want to have a reason to get up in the morning. If you've ever read the book, The Blue Zones, has anyone heard of the Blue Zones? Yeah? If you haven't, check it out. The Blue Zones followed centenarians in 8 countries that had the biggest proportion of people that lived into their hundreds, and found out, what brought them to that stage in their life. And meaning and purpose and family, and yes, diet and exercise is all part of it. But actually your genetics plays a much smaller role than your environment and your personality. That plays a much bigger role. So we all need reason and purpose. So we can also think about, does the thing I am about to say or do contribute to ageism? And this can be pretty complicated, and it can be hard to pick apart. Important to go back to how we're using those words old and young. But we sketched out this little super helpful ageism flowchart that people can use. This is online, you can look it up, to help you kind of walk through it. So it basically says the thing that I'm about to say age-related. Okay, if it's something like, happy birthday, you're 80 or whatever it is, that's age-related. But is it making an assumption or judgment? No, it's not. Okay, it's not ageist. But if we're saying like, that outfit makes you look younger, is that age-related? Yes. Is it making an assumption or judgment? Yes. That younger is better than older. Is it ageist then? Yes. Then it is. So these are the ways that we can walk through and start to recognize some of the things that we say that contribute to this misunderstanding. And then we can start to say what we mean rather than what is easily understood. So when we say things like somebody has a young spirit, what do we actually mean? What does a young spirit mean? Yeah, you're filled with life. You're energetic, you're lively, you're engaged. It doesn't mean young. Again, a young spirit could mean I'm having a temper tantrum because I don't get my way. Say what we mean. Okay, when we say, what is the other one? I feel so old. What do we mean? What does I feel so old mean when you say something like that? Your parts hurt. Yeah, it means something hurt. It usually means we're exhausted, we're tired. Again, that's not, old is not a feeling, because old could mean I feel wise. All of these things matter. When we say senior moment, we just mean what? Yeah.
You also mentioned that Alzheimer's is not
It's not a normal part of aging.
yeah.
Why is Alzheimer's? Alzheimer's is a disease process. So Alzheimer's is not normal. It's funny. Do you know the actual prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is declining, and it has been declining. Now, Alzheimer's is a terrible, terrible disease. It falls under the realm of dementias. It's not the only form of dementia, but it is a dementia. And it's a very, very difficult and challenging disease. So it needs the attention, it needs the resources. But the truth is the prevalence is actually declining, and it has been over time. It's just that we have more people that are older now. So you're gonna have more people that have it. But when you go and you look at the statistics, like I think the Alzheimer's Association will say, is it 1 out of 9 people over, it gets higher. I think it's 33% of people over the age of 85 have it. But that means 70 some odd % don't. 1 of 9 people over 65 have it. That means 8 and 9 don't. So I understand why we talk about it, because it needs the resources and it's a very debilitating disease, but it is not a normal part of aging. That's all.
Was that statistic any different for
It wasn't, but you can imagine that social isolation would exacerbate everything. Yeah, and social isolation can cause depression, and depression can also cause cognitive impairment that can mimic some kind of dementia. Yeah. Where was I? Oh, senior moment. That's where I was. That's funny. Come on, everybody, that's funny. Okay, so what does senior moment mean? I forgot. I forgot. That's all it means. So let's say what we mean instead of what's actually understood. That's really funny. I like that one. So the other thing we can do, as I said, we can define success for ourselves, and we could not get caught up in who I am today versus who I'm going to be tomorrow. This is another strategy that we can take to dismantle ageism and to think about ourselves as living, dynamic, growing creatures. If your thing today is mountain biking, it may or may not be when you're 70 or 80. You may or may not still be able to do it when you're 70 or 80. But to carry that fear around is not going to benefit you. So the truth is that every single one of us is a role model for what it means to age, and you are a role model for your age, because it's something we're all doing. Aging is universal, I'll say it again. So the way you talk about it matters. The things you say about it really make a difference. It's how we learn about it, and it's how we can unlearn about it and relearn in a different way. So you don't have to be a gerontologist who's, going around and having this conversation. The next time someone says to you, oh my gosh, I haven't seen you in forever, you haven't aged a bit, or you look great for your age, you can say, tell me more what you mean about that. Or you can say, actually, I feel pretty good in my own skin at this age in my life. We don't have to cover it up in words like seasoned or vintage or experienced. We can own being old. There's nothing wrong with being old. In fact, we're never going to have a word that destigmatizes until we destigmatize what it means to be old. We can't band-aid it. We can't cover it up. We just have to own it. So these are things we can do. Every time I do a talk like this, or most times, I have someone who's really, really well-intentioned come up to me after and say, well, I'm 70, but I feel like I'm 50. And what I want to say is, no, you're 70 and you feel 70. It's just not what you expected 70 to feel like. Okay? You feel the age you are, and that is the title of my TED Talk. You feel the age you are. No matter what age you are, that is what you are feeling, right? It's all of those things that create who we are in that moment. So I really do want you to own it. I really do want you to feel proud of it. No matter what age you are, you've worked really hard to get to this moment in your life. And I guarantee you can think about things from your past 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago that will make you cringe. That will say like, oh my gosh, I am so much more comfortable in who I am today because I have learned, because I have overcome. That's all a part of our aging. So I think the one thing that we can all do, the first step that we can all take in kind of doing this together is owning our age. And yes, I am going to make you. And we're going to say it out loud, and we're going to say it together. And it's going to be the first step that we're going to take to being role models. So I'm going to count to 3. And on the count of 3, we're all going to say, I am. And you'll say how old you are. With me? Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. I am 53 years old. Well done, everybody. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Questions for Tracy? You were very good about asking them during the presentation.
Yeah,
I'm
I
impressed by that, actually. Yes, please. Here, let me hand you a mic. Oh,
Okay, you also mentioned that the life expectancy is growing. Why is that?
So it's funny, life expectancy has been growing. It actually took a dip during COVID. And what I will say is it doesn't grow for everybody. There's a lot of health equity issues that are in that. So minoritized communities don't have the same gains in life expectancy. But when you're talking about it on average, you know, when you think about the technology that we have now, when you think about the advances that we have in healthcare and medicine, people are living longer.
Yeah, I'm just curious because with all the environmental factors that are currently on, I don't know if that would affect our generation.
It very well could.
Yeah,
Yeah,
That's my
it
question.
very well could. And climate change and actually environmental gerontology is like a new thing. And I think it will be looking at some of those kind of interactions between climate change and how that's going to affect longevity. Yeah. Got someone in the back.
So this is a question here on Zoom. Ryan is asking, why do people look forward to retirement so bad if they will just lose their purpose?
Well, I think the 9 to 5 grind for a lot of people can be exhausting. So I think there is stuff to look forward to in retirement. It could be like a whole new part in your life. All I say is that it's just not your identity, but it is an opportunity for you to create new interests, to give back in new ways. And I think a lot of people feel a sense of freedom with retirement to spend the time in more ways that they really want to. Not everybody loves working. Some people do. Some people are really lucky. I'm really lucky. I love my job, but not everybody does. And I think it gives them a sense of freedom. Yeah.
Other questions?
You're like a game show host.
Until I fall down because I trip on something.
You mentioned talking about elderhood, that they can give back to the community in a different way. What do you think that would look like?
Ooh, I think that could look like so many things. So Maggie Kuhn was the originator of the Gray Panthers. And Maggie Kuhn in the 1960s wrote about this. And she wrote about the M's. That's the M's of what she thought, I think it was 4 or 5 M's that were roles for older people: mediators, mentors, motivators, moderators, and role models. It was something like along those lines. So I think when you look at the lived experience of many older people and kind of that greater sense of integrative thinking that we have over time, they make wonderful mediators. To think about, you know, using people's talents and having flex job opportunities for people that do want to work is an opportunity. Thinking about volunteerism is a good opportunity. There's all kinds of ways. I just think right now, generally, we tend to think of older people not as contributors, but as takers. You think like the greedy geezer kind of a thing, and we don't see them as giving back. I'll put a little like interesting history thing in this. So the Industrial Revolution was definitely something that kind of moved us in the direction towards ageism. But even before then, there was an invention in like the 1600s. You probably read about it in the book, that really changed how we saw older people. Can anybody but you guess who it is? Guess what it is? What might that have been? I'll give you a clue. Older people were the keepers of knowledge. So people would very often go to elders to find out history, to find out, like, is it a good place for me to eat, to drink, a plant? Do you have a guess?
I know.
You know the answer? Say it. It's the printing press. Yeah, the development of the printing press. Because once we could mass produce knowledge, we didn't need elders for those kinds of things. But I think there's ways that we can create new opportunities. Long answer to a short question. Another one in the back. My TED Talk is April 6th. A little nervous about it. I gotta memorize it. You know, you gotta memorize those things. Like, it's not off the cuff. Oh, it's April 6th, and then it'll be out after that. It is exciting. It's very nerve-wracking too.
I noticed that it's usually the negative things we see about, or the misconceptions we have about older people, which is causing the problem. Would you say that is the problem itself, is seeing not necessarily seeing it in a positive light, but the negative aspects of the way we see it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think we tend to ignore or forget about the positive aspects. That goes back to me of that first slide I was talking about, what is aging? When we see aging is only decline, then we miss all of the positive ways that we grow, all of the positive things that we have to contribute. So yeah, we also tend to pathologize older people. We tend to talk about them like the term silver tsunami, as if it's a natural disaster that is waiting to happen. The growing of the aging population is not a natural disaster. It is an unprecedented opportunity. So I think we just need to kind of, switch that language and thinking a little bit.
Do you think, or do you know anything about the celebration of birthdays affecting any of like the mental problems that elder people suffer?
I don't know any research on that specifically, but I imagine, there's a phenomenon, I think it's Thomas More who calls it the first taste of aging, when you realize that you have less time left than lived. And there's something very real about that. And I think anybody that is older, really anybody, can tell you and share that moment. And that's real. I think to that end, fear of death and the way that we pathologize death is also part of fear of aging and part of ageism. I write in the book about a moment I had when I was at a grocery store checking out, and Betty White was still alive at the time. I think she just turned 96. And the tabloid said, Betty White, 96, giving up on life. And that moment, I was just like, wow, we see death as a failure. Like, what do you mean giving up on life? Maybe she's ready, to move on. So I think all of those messages, the fact that we don't talk about death because loss is hard, all contributes to that discomfort that we have.
So like when you talk about like aging, everyone just, all mentioned about healthcare. So what about the current impact on like plastic surgery on ageism?
Yeah. I mean, that's all a piece of it. It's, the wanting to look younger and thinking that that's magically going to make us, I don't know, feel a certain way. I mean, it's all part of it. And look, I'll say this, by all means, do what you want to do. It's your body. If you want to have plastic surgery, if you want to dye your hair, if you want to use supplements, it's your body, have at it. I think what would be helpful is just thinking about the motivation for it. Is it because you want to feel like the best version of you? Is it because you're scared of getting older? There's a difference between them. So I would just encourage people to think about why. Is it because somebody else is defining success and beauty for you? Because I think that's what happens in society.
Other questions?
Do you have any suggestions for talking to our families about stuff like this? I know my mom will say things like, oh, she looks good for her age. And I find it hard to kind of call that out and call it in. Any kind of guidance for that?
Oh, it's so hard when it comes to your family. And yes, I still do it with my family all the time. Slowly, gently, trying to point out like little things at a time, trying to make it more of a conversation than a call out. That's interesting. Why do you feel that way? Why do you think that way? Maybe passing over a book or a TEDx talk or something where it's like, here, think about this. It's only 10 minutes, something like that. But this is it ongoing. My husband had a death in his family, and we were in Boston last week. And this kind of came up where his cousin and his it's always with them, like they just almost don't want to see it and don't want to get it. So I take the little opportunities where I can, and you chip away at it over time, recognizing that this is not like, oh, I get it. It takes a moment. I will say a few years ago, my dad had a moment that just made me so happy. So he has arthritis in his shoulders, and he couldn't change a light bulb. And so he asked us to come over to help him change the light bulb, and we did. And while we were doing it, he said, this is after years, he said, you know, arthritis sucks, but aging is okay. I was like, I dropped the mic. It was like, really? Okay, we've made some progress. So little pieces at a time just open the door to some conversation. These are great questions, by the way.
I kind of have a two-part question regarding your Viagra comment.
Yeah.
You kind of painted it in a negative light, saying that this is the most advertised thing for men and that you're not a man if you're not having sex when you're older. But couldn't we see it as like a positive thing that, you know, sex is a normal part of life, that you do it your whole life, even as in elderhood? And then on top of that, how do you think we promote those products in a more positive light?
That's such a great question. And yes, I love that. I agree with you completely, because we actually have such a stigma that older people don't have sex, and we know that they do. So I think promoting that is actually really important. I think, you know, in my mind, it's just for men making sure we don't shame them, because not everybody has that drive or desire really all throughout life. Not everybody speaks that language. Some people do. So not making it like, in order to be a man, you know, then you've got to be able to do this. But yes, recognizing that sexual activity is really important for a lot of people of all ages is very important. There was a Super Bowl commercial. Oh, it was about menopause. Y'all watch the Super Bowl? There was a first thing about menopause. I'd never seen like a menopause hot flash commercial on the Super Bowl before, but it was there. And I actually am starting to wonder if maybe we are like moving in that direction a little bit. It's a really good observation.
I'm going to ask a question and break every rule you just taught us.
Ooh, go for it.
And people who know me will not be shocked at all. So I'm going to maintain the stereotype here. And I'm getting to one of the other epiphany that I had from your book. So I'm a baby boomer, and I'm on the younger end of the baby boomers. I'm going to be 65 next week.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Grateful for everyone I have.
Yeah.
Every day I wake up grateful for breath in my lungs. So one of the things that you talk about in the book, well, first, let me back up a step. When over time in my career and just general networking or friends, typically, if I'm introduced to someone who is my age or older in that baby boomer realm, I have discovered, and I'm guilty, baby boomers introduce themselves by telling you what they do, not who they are. Mm-hmm. Oh, hi, I'm Nancy Swanner. I teach in the hospitality school. Hi, I'm Nancy Swanner. I own a restaurant. Hi, I'm whatever, right? Mm-hmm. We identify who we are by what we do for a living, right? I don't know if you all know anybody or if you've experienced that, but it's been very real. Okay, so I'm 65, going to be 65. Now is that notion of this retirement piece. Mm-hmm. Or I have a great friend, Jerry Meyer from Aegis Living, called it repurposement. I love that. He repurposes. Mm-hmm. But you talk about moving from doing to being. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that was an eye-opener for me, personally, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Can you talk about that a minute, please?
Yeah, and you're right. Our identities are very, very much wrapped around work. And as I wrote in the book, that is a cultural thing. There are other cultures, I think it's France in particular, that they find that actually really offensive. You don't introduce yourself by what you do. It's about who you are. And it makes perfect sense then we say, I'm retired, as the way we introduce ourselves when our identity is wrapped up in work. But I think for many older people, the shift between doing and being is really important. And I'll illustrate it with a theory. Has anybody heard of gerotranscendence? If you haven't, it's a really cool theory, Lars Tornstrom. And he talks about a purposeful developmental cognitive shift that we make as we get older from material things being something we value to our inner world being something we value more. So according to that theory, when you see someone that maybe turns inward and is thinking about reconciling their life and thinking about who they are and thinking about their legacy, there's a lot more doing, a lot more being in that than doing, because it's the internal work that we're doing. And that we could potentially see that as a normal and very healthy part of growing older. That's kind of in direct contrast to when we're talking about, we'll get everybody socially, invested because we don't want people to be socially isolated. And that's an issue too, but there's just a different way to think about it. So there's also a term called Botsofe that I write about in the book that talks about, it's Botswanan, and it says, what if we thought about physical decline as a purposeful way of slowing down our bodies so that we could reach our spiritual potential? That's also going from doing to being. So it's just kind of redirecting and thinking about some of the quieter aspects and how that's still valuable, not just for ourselves, but maybe even valuable for others too. We live in a very busy world. Anybody that has had any kind of a disability knows that if you move slowly, it's really challenging. People get frustrated with you. It's hard to access things. We value this going, going, going. So maybe there's some value into slowing down and just being.
Thank you. Anything else? You're amazing. Thank you for making the trip to Pullman, Washington.
Smallest airport ever.
Smallest airport ever. Just a couple of things. Tracy's going to hang out with us for a while, so I would encourage you to stick around. We have some food and beverage, and we have the good stuff. We have some wine back there. No lemonade. Well, we do have lemonade, but we have the good stuff. We're in hospitality after all. So we encourage you to stick around and enjoy that. If you're a student in our HBM 375 Exploring the Business of Aging class, which starts on Tuesday, we haven't even met yet, and you came, please come by and let's introduce ourselves and get to know each other before our first class on Tuesday. If you wouldn't mind, that'd be awesome. And then one more little thing I want to share. One of the things that's been really cool about doing this work in the aging space is that we have gone out and found some faculty across our system, our entire WSU system, that are also doing work in the aging space. And we've drug them along, bribed them usually with food and drink because we have no money, whatever it might be. But trying to get people to come and so that we could do cool collaborative research projects, a variety of different things. And we do, and those people we call our part of our faculty fellows. And we have Dr. Raven Weaver, who's joined us today, who is from Human Development. And I just wanted to say thank you as one of our faculty fellows who's outside of the Hospitality School and the College of Business. So thanks for making time for us. Thanks everybody for coming. Let's enjoy our company. And again, Tracy, thank you.